Shave her head. Sergeant Knox Halden's voice cracked across the parade yard like a rifle shot. Wind pushed cold dust along the gravel, rattling against boots and metal railings. Rows of recruits stood shoulder to shoulder beneath a low gray sky, the kind that made everything look washed out and unforgiving. At the front of the formation stood the newest transfer. No rank on her chest, no patches on her sleeves, no history attached to her name. Just a blank intake sheet clipped to a clipboard in Knox's hand. "Let her remember she's nothing but a nobody in this camp," Knox barked. "Do it where everyone can see." A ripple moved through the formation, some recruits stiffening, others hiding smirks behind straight faces. Public humiliation was a language everyone at Black Ridge understood. Two military police stepped forward. One dragged a rusted stool into the center of the yard. The other held up a buzzing pair of clippers. The electric hum sliced through the wind. The woman stepped forward before anyone ordered her to, boots crunching softly against the gravel. Her name, Avalene Crossmore, sat alone on the intake sheet. One line of text, no commendations, no deployments, no disciplinary records. Nothing. Knox tapped the paper with a knuckle. "Fresh transfer with no past," he announced loudly so the whole yard could hear. "That usually means one thing." He tilted his head toward her shaved future. "Dead weight." A few recruits laughed. Avalene didn't. She lowered herself onto the stool with controlled precision, folding her hands in her lap as if sitting down for a routine check rather than a public stripping of identity. One MP gripped her shoulder. The other tilted her head forward. The clippers whined louder. The first pass carved a pale strip across her scalp. Dark strands of hair slid down her shoulders and dropped into the mud. No reaction, not even a flinch. The recruits leaned forward slightly, waiting for something, a gasp, a protest, tears. Nothing came, only the steady mechanical buzz. Knox paced slowly around her like a showman working a crowd. "You see this?" he said, gesturing toward the falling hair. "This is what happens when someone shows up here thinking they're special." More hair fell. The wind pushed it across the dirt like dead leaves. Avalene kept her eyes open. She watched the gravel beneath her boots as the clippers moved again and again, methodical and cold. If the humiliation reached her, it never reached her face. The buzzing stopped. The MP brushed loose strands from her neck. A small mirror was shoved into her hand. "Take a look," Knox sneered. "Nobody." Avalene glanced at the reflection. A bare scalp, rain-pale skin under the gray sky. Then she handed the mirror back. "Done?" she asked. Her voice was calm, flat, almost bored. The question hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Knox scoffed loudly to break the silence. "Oh, we're just getting started." He kicked the stool away with the toe of his boot. Avalene stood smoothly, dusting stray hair from her shoulders. For a moment, the entire formation seemed to hold its breath. Not because of the punishment, because of the way she carried it. Like it wasn't new, like she had stood in storms worse than this one. A cold wind rolled across the yard. Somewhere beyond the barracks, a transport truck engine idled. No one noticed the jeep pulling up near the outer gate. The rain began suddenly sharp and cold. Within seconds, the parade yard darkened under a thin curtain of water. It dripped off helmets and soaked into the dirt around Avalene's boots. Knox and Major Ethan Crowell pulled on waterproof ponchos. Avalene remained where she was, barehead, exposed to the rain. Water ran down her scalp and across her face, mixing with the last strands of hair stuck to her collar. Still, she didn't wipe it away. Crowell stepped forward, glancing over Knox's shoulder at the blank intake sheet. "No record, no skill listings," he muttered. "They sent us another washout." He snapped the clipboard shut. The formation relaxed slightly. A few recruits exchanged looks, satisfied the spectacle was over. Crowell turned to the platoon. "Let this be a lesson," he said loudly. "Weakness doesn't last long at Black Ridge." The rain intensified, tapping against the metal roofs of the barracks. Avalene stood at attention, silent, unmoving. Knox leaned close to her, voice low enough that only she could hear. "You'll be gone before the week ends." She didn't answer, didn't even look at him. From the far end of the yard, tires crunched across gravel as a dark military jeep rolled to a stop. The engine cut. A door opened. Boots hit the ground. General Roland Vexley stepped out, adjusting his cap as rain speckled the metals on his chest. His eyes scanned the yard, then stopped. On the bald woman standing in the formation. He frowned. "What's this?" he asked. Knox snapped to attention and saluted. "New transfer, sir. Discipline issue. We handled it." Vexley stepped closer. Rain slid down the tablet his aide handed him. He glanced at the shaved head, then at the intake sheet, then at the transfer code printed at the bottom of the page. For the first time since arriving, the general's expression tightened. His thumb hovered over the tablet's biometric scanner. The screen flickered to life, and suddenly, he froze. Morning had arrived quietly at Black Ridge. Before the shouting, before the mud and humiliation, before the clippers. The transport truck rolled through the outer gate just after dawn, its diesel engine coughing out a cloud of gray exhaust that hung in the cold air. Gravel snapped beneath the tires as the vehicle slowed beside the intake post. Avalene Crossmore stepped down from the truck. Her boots hit the ground with a soft crunch. No one paid attention. Recruits were already scattered around the yard, some hauling gear, others smoking beside the barracks, the smell of burnt tobacco mixing with the metallic scent of oil and wet concrete. Avalene carried a plain duffel bag over one shoulder. No markings. No decorations. Nothing that suggested experience. Her uniform looked faded, the kind that had seen too many wash cycles and not enough care. No patches on the sleeves. No rank pinned anywhere. Just fabric. A lanky recruit with a buzz cut noticed her first. He nudged the guy beside him. "Look at that," he whispered. The other recruit glanced up, squinting. "New transfer?" "Looks like it." They watched her walk past. Slow, even steps, no hurry. "Doesn't look like she belongs here," the buzzcut said. His friend snorted. "Exactly." Their laughter followed her halfway to the intake desk before dissolving into the morning wind. Sergeant Knox Halden sat inside the intake shack, leaning back in a steel chair that groaned under his weight. A toothpick hung from the corner of his mouth as he flipped through paperwork with one hand. The small room smelled of stale coffee and overheated electronics. He didn't look up when Avalene stepped inside. "Name," he muttered. "Avalene Crossmore." The chair creaked as Knox finally straightened. He grabbed the intake sheet clipped to the top of a thin folder, thin enough to raise an eyebrow. He opened it. A single page. Name. Transfer authorization. One coded line at the bottom. Nothing else. Knox leaned back again, letting out a dry laugh that echoed off the metal walls. "Well," he said slowly. "Look what the wind dragged in." He held the paper up between two fingers like it smelled bad. "No commendations. Flip. No previous assignments. Flip. No training notes." He looked at her for the first time. "Either someone lost your records," Knox said, "or you're exactly what this paper says." Avalene met his gaze. Expression calm. Still. "What does it say?" she asked. Knox tapped the page. "Nothing." He grinned. "Which means you're nothing." Outside, a whistle shrieked across the yard. Recruits scrambled into loose lines as drill instructors shouted over the wind. Knox shoved the paper back into the folder and slid it across the desk. "Welcome to Black Ridge," he said. Avalene picked up the folder. Her eyes flicked briefly to the bottom of the page. A transfer code printed in small gray text. Most people wouldn't notice it. Most people didn't know how to read military routing structures buried inside logistics codes. But Avalene did. She closed the folder. "Barracks are that way," Knox continued, pointing with the toothpick through the open door. "You'll bunk with the rest of the recruits until we decide if you're worth the oxygen." Avalene nodded once. "Yes, Sergeant." She turned and stepped outside again. The wind had picked up, carrying the distant clang of metal from the training yard. The sky hung low over the base, pressing the rows of concrete barracks into dull gray blocks that looked more like storage crates than buildings. Avalene crossed the yard without speaking to anyone. Her boots moved across gravel with the quiet rhythm of someone who had walked through many compounds before. Behind her, Knox leaned out the doorway. "Hey!" he shouted. She stopped and looked back. He tapped the folder. "You'd better hope you're tougher than your paperwork." Avalene didn't answer. She simply continued toward the barracks. Inside the intake shack, Knox tossed the folder onto his desk. The transfer code printed at the bottom caught the light for a moment. He didn't notice. Neither did the recruits outside. What Knox and the entire base failed to understand, what none of them would realize for days, was that the woman walking calmly across their yard had written the tactical doctrine they used to judge soldiers. Every drill, every evaluation method, every protocol Major Crowell worshipped like scripture, all of it traced back to one name, Avalene Crossmore. 15 years earlier, she had built the framework that defined modern field training across 3 commands. The Crow method Crowell bragged about in briefings was nothing more than a renamed adaptation of her work. But the truth of that fact sat buried deep in classified archives, behind layers of clearance most officers at Black Ridge would never see. And for now, the author of the system walked into the barracks carrying a duffel bag and a blank file. Inside the building, the air smelled of damp fabric and cleaning chemicals. Metal bunk frames lined the walls. Avalene found the one with her number stenciled on the footboard. The mattress had already been overturned. A bucket of stale water had soaked it through. Someone had kicked her locker door until the hinges bent outward. The other female recruits sat on nearby bunks watching quietly, waiting, expecting shouting, or tears. Avalena set her duffel bag on the concrete floor. She lifted the soaked mattress. Water dripped onto the ground. Then she wrung out the sheets with slow, mechanical precision. Not angry, not defeated, just working. One of the girls whispered to another, "What's wrong with her?" The other shrugged. "Maybe she hasn't figured out where she is yet." Across the room, Avalene finished twisting the last of the water from the fabric. She spread the sheet over the bare metal springs. When she finally lay down that night, there was no blanket. Only the cold grid of steel beneath her back. She closed her eyes anyway. And slept. The bugle had not sounded yet when Avalene opened her eyes. The barracks were still dark, the weak glow of a single hallway bulb leaking through the doorway. Metal bunk frames creaked softly whenever someone shifted. Somewhere near the latrine pipes, water dripped at slow, steady intervals. Tap, tap, tap. Avalene lay on the bare metal springs where the mattress had once been. Cold steel pressed through the thin fabric of her uniform. The damp sheet beneath her had stiffened overnight, carrying the sour smell of stagnant water. She rose without a sound. Across the room, the other recruits were still asleep, blankets tangled, boots kicked halfway under bunks, the heavy breathing of exhaustion filling the space. Avalene smoothed the wrung-out sheet once across the frame and folded it neatly. Then she stood. Her uniform, despite the damp barracks air, had been pressed flat against her body overnight by sheer patience. Every seam sat straight, every button aligned. When she moved toward the door, the floor gave a faint squeal beneath her boots. A recruit in the corner stirred and squinted at her. "You're up already?" the girl muttered. Avalene didn't answer. Outside, dawn hung low over Black Ridge, a pale strip of light barely visible behind the clouds. The air smelled of wet soil and rusting metal. She crossed the yard just as the first whistle shrieked. Doors burst open along the barracks row. Recruits stumbled out, pulling on jackets, fastening belts, trying to beat the countdown to morning formation. Someone noticed her standing ready. "Did she even sleep?" a voice whispered. Another recruit frowned. She didn't have a mattress. The comment passed through the line like a quiet ripple. Avalene stood at the end of the formation, posture straight, hands relaxed at her sides. Sergeant Knox emerged from the administrative building a moment later, coffee mug steaming in one hand. He scanned the ranks lazily. Then his eyes stopped on her. Still standing, still composed. His lips curled slightly. "Well," Knox said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "looks like the stray survived the night." A few recruits laughed. Knox took a sip of coffee and gestured toward the mess hall behind him. "Breakfast." The room filled quickly. Metal trays clattered against rails as recruits moved down the serving line. Steam from the kitchen, mixed with the smell of scrambled eggs, burnt toast, and cheap coffee, Avalene stepped forward with the rest. When her tray reached the counter, the server, a thin man wearing a stained apron, glanced briefly toward Knox, who leaned against the wall near the entrance. Knox lifted one eyebrow. The server nodded once. Instead of eggs, he dipped a ladle into a steel pot and poured a scoop of gray, watery gruel onto Avalene's tray. The liquid spread thin across the metal surface. No toast. No coffee. just the dull slosh of flavorless paste. Avalene took the tray without comment. Behind her, the next recruit received eggs, toast, and sausage. The difference was obvious enough to draw quiet chuckles. She turned toward the rows of tables. The mess hall buzzed with conversation forks, scraping plates, chairs dragging against the floor, voices bouncing off the concrete walls. As Avalene walked down the aisle, a boot slid out suddenly. Recruit Miller, tall, broad-shouldered, with a grin that said he'd planned the moment. The toe of his boot aimed directly at her shin. Timing perfect. Except Avalene stepped over it. Not a stumble, not even a pause. Just a smooth shift of balance that carried her past the obstruction as if it had never been there. Miller blinked. What? Before he could finish, another recruit bumped hard into Avalene's shoulder from behind. The tray slipped. Metal struck the floor with a loud clang. The gruel splattered across the tiles and soaked into the leather of her boots. The mess hall fell quiet for half a second. Then Knox's voice cut through the silence. "Clean it up, recruit." He pointed with a gloved finger from across the room. And no seconds. A few people laughed again. Avalene crouched. She used paper napkins from the nearest table, pressing them against the gray liquid spreading across the floor. The napkins tore easily. The paste clung stubbornly to the tiles. Someone at the table behind her whispered loudly enough to be heard. "Didn't even try to save it." Another voice replied. "Maybe she's used to starving." More laughter. Avalene continued wiping the floor until the last smear of gray disappeared. Her tray remained empty. When she stood, Knox was still watching. He tilted his head slightly, waiting for anger, waiting for a reaction. Avalene simply placed the clean tray onto the return rack. Then she walked toward the exit. The morning wind outside carried the smell of diesel and dust. Recruits began spilling out behind her, pulling on gloves and adjusting helmets as they prepared for the first training block of the day. Avalene moved toward the parade yard again. The sun had climbed slightly higher now, turning the dirt training ground into a wide sheet of pale brown glare. Lines began forming for afternoon drills. At the far end of the yard, Major Ethan Crowell stepped into view. His boots shone like polished mirrors, clipboard tucked under one arm. Crowell walked the formation slowly, eyes scanning each recruit with clinical disinterest. He stopped in front of Avalene. His gaze traveled from her boots to her shoulders, then up to the freshly shaved scalp. Crowell flipped open the clipboard. A blank page stared back at him. "No records," he said. He looked at Knox. "You weren't exaggerating." Knox shrugged. "Paper says she's nothing." Crowell closed the clipboard with a sharp snap. "Then she'll wash out quickly." He stepped closer to Avalene. "Tell me something, recruit," he said. "Are you a ghost?" She met his eyes calmly. "I'm here to train, sir." Crowell studied her face for a moment. Then he gave a short, dismissive laugh. "Not for long." He turned away and raised his voice for the entire formation. "Obstacle course." The recruits groaned softly as they moved toward the towering metal structures at the edge of the field. Avalene fell into line with the rest. Behind them, Knox twisted open a high-pressure hose connected to a water tank used for equipment cleaning. The valve squealed. A jet of water blasted out with a force strong enough to strip paint. Knox smiled. "Let's see how tough our mystery recruit really is." The obstacle field at Black Ridge looked less like a training ground and more like a scrapyard designed by someone who hated human bodies. Cargo nets stretched between steel poles 30 feet high. Rusted balance beams ran above trenches filled with muddy water. Concrete walls stood in staggered rows like broken teeth, forcing recruits to climb, crawl, and jump under the relentless sun. By the time the platoon reached the starting line, the air already carried the smell of heated metal and churned dirt. Major Crowell checked his stopwatch. Sergeant Knox stood off to the side beside the water tank, the heavy hose coiled loosely at his feet. "Listen up," Crowell shouted. "This course measures endurance, coordination, and discipline. If you fail a section, you run it again." His gaze slid toward Avalene. And again. The recruits lined up. A whistle shrieked. Bodies exploded forward across the dirt. Boots pounded the ground. Gravel scattered underfoot. Someone slipped on the first hurdle and slammed into the dust with a curse. Avalene moved through the first section without hurry. Over the beam, under the barbed crawl, up the wooden wall. Her movements were economical, no wasted energy, no showmanship, just precise control. Crowell watched her with narrowed eyes. "She's too calm," he muttered. Knox grinned. "Let's fix that." Avalene reached the cargo net tower. The ropes were slick with old rain and mud. Each knot scraped against her palms as she began climbing. 10 feet, 15, 20. Below her, Knox lifted the hose. The valve shrieked as it opened. A violent jet of water blasted upward. The stream struck Avalene square in the face. The force snapped her head backward. Water hammered against her chest and shoulders, tearing at her grip. Gasps rose from the recruits still climbing below. The pressure could rip someone off the ropes. Avalene's fingers tightened. She wrapped one leg through the webbing and leaned forward into the blast, climbing blind against the torrent. Water ran down her arms and soaked her uniform, turning the ropes slicker with every second. But she kept moving. Hand, foot, hand, foot. At the top platform, she rolled over the edge, coughing once as she pulled air back into her lungs. Crowell checked his watch. "Missed a foothold," he said flatly. Avalene looked down at him. Crowell tapped the stopwatch. "Disqualified." He pointed back to the starting line. Again, the other recruits gathered in the shade of a steel storage shed, breathing heavily as they watched her descend. Avalene dropped from the final platform, boots hitting the dirt. She walked back to the start. No complaint. No argument. Crowell raised the whistle again. The second run was harder. Her uniform clung to her body now, soaked and heavy. Mud stuck to her boots. Every obstacle required more effort than the last. Knox used the hose again. The water struck harder this time. She climbed through it. When she reached the finish line, Crowell barely glanced up. "Foot placement error," he said. The recruits exchanged uneasy looks. "That was clean," someone whispered. Crowell didn't care. "Run it again." The third run pushed her lungs to their limit. Her breathing grew deeper, heavier. But the rhythm of her movement never broke. When she crossed the line the final time, she staggered forward half a step, then forced herself upright again immediately. Crowell stared at her. For a moment, something like irritation flickered behind his eyes. He looked down at the clipboard. "Gear inspection," he said. The recruits moved toward the equipment tables set along the side of the yard. Packs were opened and lined up in neat rows across the wooden surfaces. Avalene set her pack down and began arranging the contents. Field rations, first aid kit, radio, compass. Each item placed with deliberate order. Crowell approached slowly. His polished boots stopped beside her table. He studied the pack for a moment, then kicked it. The equipment scattered across the dirt. Gasps came from nearby recruits. Crowell bent down and picked up the field radio. Unlike the sleek digital models carried by the others, Avalene's unit was older, heavier, with a thick metal casing. Crowell turned it in his hands. "This antique still functional?" he asked. Without waiting for an answer, he dropped it. The radio struck the concrete edge of the table with a sharp crack. The casing split open. Crowell shrugged. "Defective gear implies defective soldier." He scribbled something on his clipboard. "A demerit. One severe enough to ruin a recruit's weekly standing." Crowell glanced back at the scattered equipment. 10 seconds, he said. "Repack." Avalene knelt. She began gathering the pieces. Rations. Compass. Broken radio. Her hands moved quickly, but the task was impossible. The timer beeped. "Time," Crowell announced. He closed the clipboard. Failure. Knox stepped forward carrying 2 wooden ammunition crates. Each box stamped with black lettering. 80 Pfund. He dropped them heavily at Avalene's feet. "Since you can't manage basic equipment," Knox said cheerfully, "you'll carry these for the rest of the day." The wood thudded against the ground. Dust rose around them. Avalene lifted the first crate. Then, the second. The weight pressed down across her shoulders as she secured them against her body. Leather straps bit into the muscle of her trapezius. Crowell blew the whistle again. Formation. The platoon began marching across the yard. Avalene moved to the back of the line, the crates balanced against her frame. With every step, the wood shifted slightly, digging deeper into her shoulders. After half a mile, dark stains began to appear on her collar. blood from the straps cutting through the skin. But she didn't slow. Not once. By the time the sun began to sink toward the western ridge, the platoon's pace had slowed from exhaustion. Avalene still carried the crates. Knox watched from the edge of the field. His grin had faded slightly. "Stubborn," he muttered. Crowell looked out across the yard. The recruits moved like shadows across the orange dirt. In the fading light, Avalene walked behind them, shoulders bleeding, expression unchanged. Crowell tapped his clipboard thoughtfully. "Let's see how she handles the night," he said quietly. Because Black Ridge had a way of breaking people after dark. Night settled over Black Ridge with a slow, suffocating heaviness. The training yard emptied, leaving behind only scattered footprints in the dirt and the distant hum of generators powering the barracks. Wind brushed against the metal siding, producing a low, hollow rattle that echoed down the sleeping rows of buildings. Inside the barracks, the lights had been cut for hours. Most of the recruits slept hard after the day's drills, their breathing thick and uneven. Boots lay scattered across the floor. Someone snored loudly near the latrine corner. The smell of damp canvas and detergent hung in the air. Avalene lay on her bunk. The metal springs beneath her back had long since stopped bothering her. Her shoulders still throbbed where the ammunition crates had cut into the skin earlier that day. Each breath carried a dull ache through her ribs, but her eyes were open. The room was dark enough that shapes blurred into shadow. Then, a soft creak broke the silence. Not the random shift of a sleeper. Something deliberate. A second creak followed. Slow footsteps. 4 shapes moved between the bunks, flashlights covered by fingers to dim the beams. The narrow streaks of light slid across the floor like knives. One of the figures carried a bar of soap wrapped tightly inside a rolled towel. Another held the same. The oldest trick in barracks intimidation. The lead attacker whispered, barely louder than breath. "She's over there." A thin line of light brushed across Avalene's bunk. Still, motionless. The figures approached. One of them raised the wrapped bar. The towel tightened in his grip. He drew his arm back. Before the swing could fall, Avalene moved. The motion was so fast the flashlight beams jittered wildly. Her hand shot upward, catching the attacker's wrist mid-arc. Her fingers pressed sharply into the cluster of nerves between tendon and bone. The boy collapsed instantly. His knees hit the floor with a muffled thud as the towel and soap clattered beside him. No scream, just a strangled gasp as his arm went numb. Avalene stood. Moonlight from the window touched the side of her shaved scalp, reflecting faint silver across the room. She didn't twist his wrist further, didn't strike him. She simply held the pressure point long enough for the message to sink in. The other 3 froze. Flashlight beams trembled in their hands. Avalene's eyes moved from one face to another. Cold, precise, not angry. Professional. She released the wrist. The recruit scrambled backward across the floor, clutching his arm as sensation slowly returned. "Go," Avalene said quietly. The word carried across the dark barracks like a blade sliding into its sheath. None of them argued. Within seconds, the 4 shapes vanished back into their bunks. Silence returned. Avalene lay down again. The springs beneath her shifted slightly. Her breathing slowed. Outside, the wind continued to scrape along the building walls. Morning arrived with the metallic clang of the mail cart rolling across the concrete. Recruits gathered in the yard, forming loose ranks, while Knox stood beside a wooden crate filled with envelopes. Mail call at Black Ridge was rarely exciting. Most recruits received nothing. Some received bills. A few got letters from home. Knox flipped through the stack with theatrical boredom. Read, nothing. More or less, junk. Jenkins, bill collectors must love you. Laughter moved through the line. Knox pulled another envelope from the stack. He paused. Avalene Crossmore. The recruits turned their heads slightly. Knox held the envelope up between 2 fingers. Thin paper. No return stamp visible from a distance. "Well, well," Knox said. "Looks like someone still remembers you exist." Avalene stepped forward. He didn't hand it over. Instead, he held it up toward the sunlight, squinting as if trying to see through it. "Probably a cry for help," he said loudly. "Dear Mommy, the mean sergeant hurt my feelings." A few recruits snickered. Avalene stood still. Knox tilted the envelope. Or maybe it's a love letter. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small lighter. The metal lid snapped open with a sharp click. The flame flickered to life. Knox held the corner of the envelope over the fire. The paper darkened, curled. Within seconds, the flame spread across the edge. The recruits watched the fire eat through the letter. Black flakes drifted down like ash. Avalene's eyes followed the burning paper. The envelope contained the last letter from someone who had once served beside her. Someone who had never made it home. But her face didn't change. She didn't reach for it. Didn't speak. The flame consumed the last corner. Knox dropped the charred remains to the dirt at her feet. "Guess it wasn't important," he said. Avalene looked down at the ash. Then she stepped forward. Her boot pressed the remains into the soil, grinding the fragments into gray powder. The wind lifted a few of the lighter pieces and carried them away across the yard. Knox frowned slightly. He had expected shouting, maybe tears. Instead, there was nothing. No reaction. Only silence. He snapped the lighter shut and tossed the empty mail crate aside. "Back in formation," he barked. The recruits moved quickly to obey. Avalene returned to the line. A few of the others glanced sideways at her. Not mocking this time. Something else had crept into their expressions. Unease. Because they had seen what happened in the barracks the night before. And now they had seen the letter burn, without breaking her. Across the yard, Major Crowell watched the entire scene from the steps of the command office. His eyes narrowed slightly. He tapped his clipboard against his palm. "Interesting," he murmured. Black Ridge had tested hundreds of recruits. Most cracked within the first 48 hours. But the woman with the shaved head, she wasn't cracking. Not yet. Crowell closed the clipboard slowly. "Let's raise the pressure," he said, because sometimes the only way to expose weakness was to make everyone else hate the target first. The order came just after noon. The sun hung high over Black Ridge, flattening the yard under a pale sheet of heat. Dust lifted from every step the recruits took as they assembled again in formation, sweat darkening the backs of their uniforms. Major Crowell stepped forward with his clipboard. He didn't raise his voice immediately. Instead, he scanned the lines slowly, letting the silence stretch. Then he stopped. A faint smirk appeared. "Recruit failed to salute properly this morning," he said. A few heads turned. Avalene remained still. Crowell lifted his clipboard slightly, as if confirming the note written there. "Because of that failure," he continued, "the entire platoon will run 10 miles. A groan rippled through the line. In full gear. Helmets tightened. Packs were lifted onto shoulders. Several recruits turned toward Avalene with immediate hostility. Crowell stepped back. "Start running." The whistle pierced the air. Boots hit the dirt. Within seconds, the platoon stretched across the training road that circled the outer ridge of the base. Dust kicked up around their ankles. Metal buckles clattered with each stride. Avalene ran near the middle at first, the rhythm of the formation settling around her. The pack on her shoulders shifted slightly with every step, the straps digging into the skin already raw from the ammunition crates earlier. Behind her, someone muttered under their breath, "This is her fault." Another voice answered louder, "Yeah, thanks, Crossmore." A shoulder slammed into her side. Not hard enough to knock her down, just enough to send the message. Avalene adjusted her balance and kept moving. The road curved along a shallow ditch filled with dry weeds. Heat shimmered above the dirt like a thin layer of smoke. By mile 3, breathing across the formation had grown heavier. Sweat ran down faces. The muttering turned into open resentment. "You couldn't salute, right?" Someone snapped between breaths. Another recruit shoved her elbow sharply into Avalene's ribs while passing. The impact jolted through her chest. Avalene didn't respond. She kept the same steady pace. At mile 5, the formation had broken into uneven clusters. Some recruits struggled to keep up. Others ran harder, driven by anger rather than endurance. Avalene gradually moved toward the front, not by sprinting, simply by maintaining the same rhythm while others slowed. Crowell watched from the back of a slow-moving jeep that followed the route. Dust rolled behind the tires as he observed the shifting positions. "Interesting," he muttered. Knox leaned against the side rail beside him. "They're starting to turn on her." "Good," Crowell said. Ahead, the road narrowed slightly. The ditch along the side deepened. At mile 7 it happened. One of the recruits, tall, broad, face red with exhaustion, veered sideways suddenly. His shoulder slammed into Avalene's back. The push aimed straight toward the ditch. Her boot slid on loose gravel. For a split second, her body tilted toward the drop. But instead of falling, Avalene pivoted. Her right foot rotated across the dirt, redirecting her momentum. Her shoulders twisted with the movement, absorbing the shove without losing stride. She kept running. The recruit who had pushed her stumbled instead, nearly tripping over his own feet before recovering. He stared at her back in disbelief. How did... The words died in his throat. Avalene had already pulled ahead. By mile 8, the group had thinned drastically. The strongest runners pushed forward. Avalene led them now. Not because she was racing, because she never slowed. Those behind her had no choice but to match her pace if they wanted to finish. Their hatred didn't disappear. If anything, it grew sharper. Every step forced them to chase the very person they blamed. At the final stretch near the training yard, several recruits collapsed the moment they crossed the line. Hands on knees, gasping for air. Avalene slowed to a stop only after the last runner staggered across. Crowell stepped out of the jeep. Dust drifted around his boots. His eyes followed the exhausted platoon before settling again on Avalene. I'm still upright, breathing controlled. Sweat ran down the sides of her shaved scalp, tracing thin lines along her temples. Crowell's expression hardened slightly. Simulation range, he announced. Groans followed immediately. But the recruits moved. The tactical training field sat behind the main yard rows of steel targets mounted on moving rails, electronic boards tracking accuracy and response time. Rifles were distributed from a metal rack. Each recruit received one in sequence. When Avalene stepped forward, Knox handed her a weapon last. The rifle looked normal, until she cycled the bolt. There was a faint hitch in the movement, almost imperceptible. Someone had filed down the firing pin. The defect meant the weapon would jam after nearly every shot. Avalene said nothing. The recruits spread across their firing lanes. Crowell's voice came over the loudspeaker. Targets will appear randomly. Hit center mass. A buzzer sounded. Steel silhouettes popped up along the range. Gunfire cracked through the air. Avalene fired once. The rifle clicked. Jam. Exactly as expected. Crowell's voice came again through the speakers. Well, look at that. Laughter crackled through the line. Avalene dropped to one knee. Her hands moved quickly across the rifle. Bolt out. Pin assembly exposed. Her fingers, already rough from the day's training, slipped slightly against the metal. She wiped them against her sleeve and continued. 4 seconds. The bolt snapped back into place. She fired again. Hit. Another jam. She cycled the bolt manually this time. Another shot. Another hit. The rhythm continued slow, mechanical, precise. The electronic board beside her lane began tallying the impacts. Center mass. Center mass. Center mass. Crowell watched the numbers climb. His jaw tightened. System glitch, he said abruptly. The power cut. The targets dropped. The board reset instantly to 0. The recruits lowered their rifles. Avalene stood. The rifle hung loosely at her side, metal still warm from the repeated shots. Crowell shut off the loudspeaker. Training complete, he said flatly. Knox glanced toward him. You erased the score. Crowell closed the clipboard. She didn't break, he replied quietly. Across the range, Avalene walked back toward the barracks with the others. The recruits avoided looking directly at her now. Not because they respected her, because something about her endurance had begun to disturb them. And Crowell knew one thing with certainty. If the pressure didn't increase soon, Black Ridge might discover it had been testing the wrong person all along. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the ridgeline when the platoon returned to the obstacle field again. The heat of the day lingered in the dirt, rising in faint waves that blurred the edges of the training towers. Recruits moved stiffly now, legs heavy from the miles they had already run. Avalene moved with them. Her shoulders still carried faint lines where straps had cut into the skin earlier. Dried blood had darkened the collar of her uniform, though the fabric had hardened enough to hide the wounds beneath it. Crow watched the line assemble. His patience had grown thin. Black Ridge had a rhythm, pressure, fracture, elimination. Recruits either collapsed under it or they learned quickly enough to stay invisible. But the bald woman standing at the end of the formation had done neither. She endured. That irritated him. "Obstacle run," Crowell announced. The recruits groaned quietly but stepped forward toward the course again. The whistle blew. Bodies surged toward the first barrier. Avalene moved through the opening stretch with the same steady rhythm she had shown all week: balanced steps, measured breathing, careful placement of hands and feet. Then it happened. At the edge of the climbing wall, her forearm scraped against a jagged edge of rusted steel. The metal tore into her skin. The cut opened instantly. Blood ran down her arm in a bright red stream that dripped into the dirt below. She didn't stop climbing. By the time she cleared the obstacle and dropped to the ground, her sleeve was soaked halfway to the elbow. A few recruits noticed. "Hey," someone muttered. "She's bleeding." Avalene continued the course. Hand over hand, wall over wall. When she finished, Crowell barely glanced up from his clipboard. "Medical tent is that way," he said without interest. Avalene walked across the yard toward the small canvas shelter beside the motor pool. Inside, the medic sat on a folding chair with a mug of coffee in his hand. Sergeant Knox leaned against the tent pole beside him, talking lazily. The smell of antiseptic mixed with stale caffeine. The medic looked up as Avalene stepped inside. His gaze dropped immediately to the blood running down her arm. "That's it?" he said. Avalene said nothing. The medic reached into a crate beside him and tossed a roll of gauze onto the table. It bounced once and rolled toward her. "Wrap it," he said. "Stop wasting resources." He turned back toward Knox, who smirked slightly. Avalene picked up the gauze. For a moment she stood still. Then she walked out of the tent. The sun had dropped lower now, shadows stretching across the base. Behind the latrine building, the air smelled of bleach and damp earth. Avalene crouched beside the concrete wall. She opened her repair kit. Inside were the small tools. Every field soldier carried thread, needle, spare buttons, tape. She threaded the needle calmly. Then she pressed the edge of the wound together with her fingers. The needle pierced her skin. Once, twice, 3 times. Each pull of the thread closed the gap a little further. Her breathing stayed even. The metallic scent of blood mixed with the sour smell of the nearby drains. When the final knot tightened, she cut the thread with her teeth. She wiped the remaining blood away with a strip of cloth and pulled her sleeve down. 10 minutes later, she walked back into formation. No one asked where she had been. Crowell stepped forward again. He scanned the line until his eyes landed on her. Then he smiled. "Recruit Jenkins," he called. A thin boy near the middle of the formation stepped forward nervously. He looked younger than the others, underweight, shoulders narrow under the weight of his gear. Crowell shoved him toward Avalene. "This one's weak," Crowell said loudly, holding the platoon back. Jenkins looked terrified. Crowell turned to Avalene. "Teach him something." The recruits leaned forward slightly. Crowell's voice hardened. "Break his nose." The yard fell silent. Wind pushed loose dust across the ground between them. Jenkins' eyes widened. He looked at Avalene as if begging for mercy. Crowell folded his arms. "Or," he added, "you take the punishment meant for him." The line watched. Avalene looked at Jenkins. The boy trembled under the weight of the moment. Then she lifted her gaze to Crowell. Her hands dropped slowly to her sides. "I will not strike a teammate, sir." Her voice carried clearly across the yard. Crowell's face darkened. "Insubordination," he hissed. Before anyone moved, Crowell turned and struck Jenkins himself. The blow sent the boy sprawling into the dirt. Gasps rippled through the formation. Crowell stepped closer to Avalene, fury rising in his eyes. "Now we have you," he said quietly. Knox circled in from the side, his grin returning. He tugged lightly at the short stubble of hair beginning to grow along Avalene's scalp. "You know what's funny?" Knox said loudly to the platoon. "That mop on your head." A few recruits laughed uneasily. "This isn't a salon," Knox continued. "We don't do pretty here." Someone in the line shouted, "Shave it!" The idea spread quickly. "Yeah, make her one of us!" Knox's grin widened. He turned toward the equipment table and picked up the clippers. The small motor buzzed to life. A harsh, electric sound that carried across the yard. "Bring the chair," Knox ordered. An aide dragged a stool into the center of the formation. Two MPs stepped forward automatically. Avalene didn't resist as they guided her toward the seat. The metal legs scraped across the gravel as she sat. One MP twisted her arm behind her back. The other pressed a hand against the top of her head. Knox stepped forward with the clippers humming in his hand. "Let's finish the job properly," he said. Around them, the platoon watched. Some curious, some uncomfortable, most simply silent. The clippers moved closer to Avalene's scalp. She stared down at the dirt beneath her boots, cataloging the moment, every voice, every face, every violation. Because somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath the calm surface she never allowed to crack, she knew a reckoning was coming. And when it did, Black Ridge would have to answer for everything. The clippers buzzed louder as Knox stepped closer. The sound filled the training yard like an angry swarm of insects. Recruits leaned forward slightly in the loose circle around the stool, the late afternoon wind pushing dust across their boots. Two MPs held Avalene in place. One pressed her shoulder down. The other twisted her arm behind her back, forcing her posture forward as if they expected her to fight. She didn't. Avalene simply adjusted her breathing. Slow inhale, slow exhale. Her gaze stayed on the gravel beneath her boots. Knox tilted his head, studying her expression. Still nothing. "Hold her still," he said theatrically to the MPs. "Don't want the little lady squirming." A few recruits laughed. Knox nudged the stool with his boot, making it wobble slightly. The metal legs scraped against the stones. Avalene's body compensated automatically, balancing the shift with subtle tension through her core. Knox switched the clippers on fully. The motor whined. He grabbed a short strand of dark hair that had begun to grow back along the edge of her scalp. "See this?" Knox said loudly to the formation. "This is fluff. Distraction." The clippers moved. The metal teeth dragged across her head again. The remaining hair fell away in thin strips, scattering across the ground like dark feathers. The yard grew quieter. The earlier laughter faded as the act continued. Something about the way Avalene sat there motionless, eyes open, breathing steady, began to feel strange, almost unsettling. Knox kept talking to fill the silence. "You show up here thinking you're special," he said, pacing around her. "Thinking you're tougher than the system." Another pass of the clippers. Hair slid down the back of her neck. "But this place strips that nonsense away." More hair fell. "You're nobody here." When he finished, Knox stepped back and switched the clippers off. The sudden silence rang in everyone's ears. He grabbed a small mirror from the table beside him and shoved it toward her face. "Take a look," he sneered. "Perfect match for that empty file." Avalene looked at the reflection. A clean scalp under the fading light, a faint sheen of sweat and dust. She studied it for exactly 1 second. Then she handed the mirror back. "Done?" she asked quietly. The calmness in her voice spread through the circle like a ripple. Knox frowned. Before he could answer, the wind shifted. A sharp drop in temperature rolled across the yard. The sky darkened without warning. Then the rain came, cold, sudden. Within seconds, a sheet of water swept across Black Ridge, drumming against rooftops and turning the dirt underfoot into thick mud. Recruits scrambled to pull jackets tighter. Crowell and Knox stepped back under the overhang near the equipment rack, slipping on waterproof ponchos. Avalene remained where she was. Rain struck her exposed scalp immediately. The cold sting of the water ran down her face and neck, soaking through the thin fabric of her uniform. Loose hair stuck to her shoulders and collar, turning into dark paste against the cloth. Still, she didn't move. The stool sat in the center of the yard like a stage prop abandoned in a storm. Avalene stood beside it. A statue in the rain. Crowell stepped closer, clipboard protected under his poncho. He scribbled something quickly. "Spirit's weak," he muttered. "Easy to snap." He turned toward the platoon. "Anyone else want to test us?" No one spoke. The rain grew heavier. Water ran in thin streams across the yard, carrying clumps of hair and dirt toward the drainage ditch. One recruit near the front shifted uncomfortably. Another looked away. The spectacle that had seemed entertaining minutes earlier now felt different. Knox noticed the change. He stepped back into the rain, raising his voice again. "What's the matter?" he barked. "Thought you wanted the show." A stocky recruit with acne scars pointed toward Avalene. Looks like she belongs in a salon now, he laughed. Another voice added, bald and broke. A few weak chuckles followed. One recruit spat on the ground near Avalene's boots. The spit landed in the mud, splashing a thin line of brown water against the leather. Avalene looked down, then up. Her eyes settled on the recruit who had spat. Clean it, she said quietly. The rain softened the edges of her voice, but the words still carried. The recruit blinked. For a moment, he looked almost uncertain. Then Knox burst out laughing. You don't give orders here, he said loudly. Not with that shiny head. The laughter returned, louder now that Knox had reclaimed the moment. Avalene said nothing else. She simply stood there as the rain continued to fall. Water streamed down her face and along the curve of her scalp. From a distance, she looked less like a recruit now and more like a monument carved from pale stone. Unmoving. Unbent. Crowell finished writing his note and snapped the clipboard closed. Formation dismissed, he called. The recruits scattered quickly, eager to escape the storm. Within minutes, the yard emptied. Only a few figures remained. Knox, Crowell, the MPs, and the bald woman standing quietly in the rain. Far beyond the gates of the base, the low rumble of an approaching engine echoed faintly through the storm. A military jeep rolled down the gravel road leading toward Black Ridge. Headlights cut through the curtain of rain. Inside the vehicle, General Roland Vexley glanced out at the training yard as the jeep approached the entrance. His driver slowed near the gate. From a distance, through the rain-streaked windshield, Vexley noticed a lone figure standing in the center of the yard. Bald. Motionless. Even in the storm. Who's that? He asked. The driver shrugged. Probably a recruit, sir. The jeep rolled through the gate. Rain hammered against the hood as it approached the yard. Avalene still hadn't moved. Not even when the headlights swept across her. Not even when the jeep came to a stop nearby. The passenger door opened. Boots stepped onto the wet gravel. General Vexley looked up at the figure standing in the rain. His eyes narrowed. Something about her posture felt familiar. He walked closer, water dripping from the brim of his cap. Sergeant, he called toward Knox. What exactly is going on here? Knox straightened quickly and saluted. Discipline issue, sir. New transfer. Vexley looked again at the bald woman. Then, at the intake sheet, Knox handed him. His gaze drifted slowly toward the small code printed at the bottom of the page. For a moment, the general said nothing. Rain pattered against the paper. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a secure tablet. The screen lit up under the storm's gray light. His thumb hovered over the biometric scanner. And suddenly, the yard felt very quiet. Rain hammered the parade yard. Water ran down the surface of General Vexley's tablet as his thumb pressed against the biometric scanner. The device beeped softly, a sharp electronic sound barely audible beneath the storm. For a moment, the screen stayed dark. Then the encryption layers began to peel back. Red text appeared first. Clearance level, Omega 7. Vexley's brow tightened. Beside him, his young aide leaned closer to the glowing screen. The lieutenant's eyes moved quickly across the scrolling data and then froze. His face drained of color. The rain dripped from the brim of his cap as he stared at the kneeling figure in the mud. He had noticed something earlier. A small detail most people would miss. A thin scar just below the line of Avalene's ear. A scar he had seen before in classified briefing photos tied to an operation in the Balkans more than a decade earlier. His breath caught. Sir, the aide tried to say. But the words stuck in his throat. On the tablet, another line unlocked. Identity confirmed. The name appeared in bold across the screen. Colonel Avalene Crossmore. The rain seemed to grow louder. Vexley stood abruptly. Stop everything, he shouted. His voice cut through the storm like a thunderclap. Knox froze mid-sentence. Crowell turned sharply. Sir? Knox asked. Vexley swung toward them, holding the tablet out. You idiots, he snapped. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Knox blinked. Sir? Vexley thrust the screen closer to his face. You just shaved the head of your superior officer. For a moment, the words didn't register. Then Knox's mouth opened slightly. Crowell leaned closer to the screen. The rain streaked across the display, but the name remained unmistakable. Colonel Avalene Crossmore, Operational clearance, Omega 7. Special assignment, Black Ridge evaluation. Crowell's fingers tightened around his clipboard. That's impossible, he muttered. Vexley turned toward the woman still kneeling in the mud. Colonel, he said. Avalene rose slowly. Mud slid off her knees as she stood. For the first time since the storm began, she lifted her gaze fully. The recruits who had lingered under the barracks overhang watched in stunned silence. The aide hurried toward the jeep and returned with a sealed envelope bearing a dark insignia. He handed it to Avalene with shaking hands. She opened it calmly. Inside was a folded patch. A black insignia stitched with the Omega 7 symbol. Avalene attached it to the front of her uniform. The small piece of fabric changed the air in the yard instantly. Crowell stared at the tablet again. Scrolling further down the file, his eyes widened. There was another section. A classified addendum. The general turned the screen toward him. "Recognize this?" Vexley asked. Crowell leaned closer. The file displayed a familiar document, one he had studied for years. The tactical doctrine manual used across several commands. The foundation of every drill, evaluation method, and training procedure at Black Ridge. At the bottom of the page sat a signature. Author, Call, Avalene Crossmore. Crowell's clipboard slipped from his hands. The plastic edge struck the gravel with a loud crack. "You've been grading the architect," Vexley said coldly, using her own blueprint. Knox staggered back half a step. His earlier confidence evaporated under the rain. Avalene walked toward him. Slow. Deliberate. Each step splashed softly through the mud. Knox's breathing quickened. "Ma'am, I didn't know," he began. Avalene reached up. Her hand grasped the stripes on his collar. For a second, she simply held them. The fabric felt rough between her fingers. Then she pulled. The tearing sound cut through the rain. Knox's rank insignia ripped free from his uniform. Avalene held the cloth for a moment, examining it like a damaged tool. Then she dropped it into the mud at his feet. "Rank is earned," she said quietly. Her voice was almost lost beneath the rain, but Knox heard every word. "And you're overdrawn." Knox's shoulders sagged. Behind them, MPs who had been waiting near the vehicles stepped forward. Crowell tried to speak. "There's been a misunderstanding." Avalene lifted one hand slightly. He fell silent instantly. She turned to Vexley's aide. "Access Major Crowell's pension account," she said. The aide's fingers flew across the tablet. Rain dotted the screen. "Flag it for gross misconduct," Avalene continued. "Audit every financial allocation for the last 10 years. The aide nodded. "Accounts frozen, Colonel." Crowell's knees buckled. He dropped into the mud beside the fallen clipboard. The realization hit him all at once. Career. Reputation. Everything built at Black Ridge. Gone. Avalene stepped past him without looking down. "You wanted to weed out the unfit," she said. Her voice remained calm. "Mission accomplished." Around the yard, the base security screens flickered on. Large monitors mounted along the command building came alive in the rain. Video logs appeared. Hidden camera footage. Training yard recordings. Time-stamped clips of every moment from the past week. Knox shouting. Crowell falsifying scores. Recruits laughing as the humiliation unfolded. The evidence rolled across the screens in stark digital clarity. One recruit whispered, "Oh my God." MPs moved forward. Metal cuffs clicked open. Knox didn't resist. His shoulders slumped as the cuffs closed around his wrists. Crowell stared blankly at the ground. The rain washed dirt across the training yard as the two officers were led toward the waiting vehicles. The remaining recruits stood frozen in place. No one spoke. Avalene turned slowly toward them. She walked down the line, boots splashing through the muddy water. She stopped in front of the recruit who had spat near her earlier. The boy couldn't lift his eyes. Then she moved to the girl who had mocked her clothes. Tears ran down the girl's face now. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Avalene said nothing. She simply continued walking. The silence hurt worse than punishment. At the center of the yard, General Vexley snapped to attention. He raised his hand in a crisp salute. "Colonel," he said, "the base is yours." Avalene returned the salute. Her bald scalp glistened under the rain. "I didn't come here for respect," she said. She looked across the silent yard. I came to see who deserved to lead. The storm ended sometime before dawn. By morning, Black Ridge looked different. Not because the buildings had changed. The same concrete barracks stood in rigid rows. The same rusted obstacle towers cast long shadows across the training yard. But the air felt stripped. The parade ground had been washed clean by the rain. Mud still clung to the edges of the field where boots had churned the earth the night before, but the center now lay flat and quiet under the pale morning light. The usual shouting hadn't started yet. No whistles. No insults echoing across the yard. Just wind moving gently across the gravel. Avalene Crossmore walked alone across the parade ground. Her boots pressed softly into the damp dirt as she moved past the obstacle course, past the range, past the rows of barracks where recruits watched from behind windows. The shaved scalp that had once been meant as humiliation now caught the morning light like polished steel. No one laughed anymore. Inside the administrative building, the halls smelled faintly of cleaning solvent and damp paper. Several doors stood open where investigators had already begun cataloging records during the night. 2 MPs escorted Sergeant Knox down the corridor. His uniform looked smaller without the stripes on his collar. He avoided looking up as Avalene passed. For the first time since she arrived at Black Ridge, he had nothing to say. Further down the hall, Major Crowell sat at a metal table while an officer from Internal Oversight reviewed documents on a tablet. Crowell's eyes followed Avalene when she entered the room. The arrogance that had once defined him had drained away. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Avalene stopped beside the table. For a moment she simply studied him. Crowell looked like a man who had already understood the answer. "Court-martial," she said. The word landed gently, but its weight was absolute. Crowell lowered his gaze to the table. Avalene turned and continued down the hallway. Outside, the recruits had begun assembling again in the training yard, but the formation looked different. Straighter, quieter. When Avalene stepped onto the field, the entire platoon snapped to attention automatically. No one had ordered it. The motion rippled down the line like instinct. Avalene walked slowly in front of them. Some recruits stared straight ahead. Others struggled to hide the shame in their faces. She recognized them all. The boy who had shoved her during the run. The one who had tried to strike her in the dark. The recruit who had spat near her boots. And the girl who had laughed when the clippers first buzzed. Avalene stopped in front of them one by one. She didn't raise her voice. Didn't lecture. Didn't threaten. She simply looked and moved on. The silence forced each of them to stand alone, with the memory of what they had done. At the far end of the formation stood Jenkins. The thin recruit Crowell had tried to use as a weapon. Jenkins held his posture rigidly, eyes forward. But when Avalene stopped in front of him, he swallowed nervously. She studied him for a moment. Then she nodded once, the smallest gesture, but it felt heavier than any speech. Avalene stepped back toward the center of the yard. General Vexley stood nearby, hands behind his back. "The investigations have already started," he said quietly. Avalene nodded. "Knox? Detained. And Crowell?" His accounts were frozen this morning. Vexley glanced toward the recruits. "They're waiting for orders." Avalene followed his gaze. For several seconds she said nothing. The wind moved softly across the yard again. Finally she stepped forward. "Black Ridge has one purpose," she said. Her voice carried clearly without needing to rise. "To prepare soldiers for the worst conditions they will ever face." The recruits listened without moving. "That purpose was lost here." She paused. "But it won't stay that way." Avalene's eyes moved across the line. "Starting today, every evaluation, every drill, every command issued on this base will follow the doctrine it claims to represent." Her words were calm, controlled, but they carried the weight of authority the recruits could feel instantly. "No humiliation," she continued. "No falsified scores. No abuse hidden behind protocol." A few recruits exchanged glances. Avalene let the silence stretch for a moment before finishing. "If you fail here," she said, "it will be because you weren't ready, not because someone decided you were expendable." The wind rustled across the yard again. Vexley watched her quietly. After a moment, he raised his hand and saluted once more. Avalene returned the salute. Then she turned and began walking across the field again. The recruits held formation until she disappeared beyond the training towers. In the weeks that followed, the changes at Black Ridge spread quickly. Knox's court-martial ended his career. Crowell was reassigned to a remote administrative post while investigators dismantled the reputation he had built over years. The recruits who had mocked Avalene carried the memory of that week with them long after training ended. Some transferred out. Some stayed, but none forgot. Each morning, Avalene walked the base before sunrise, inspecting the course, the range, the barracks. Her shaved head remained uncovered. Not as punishment, not as humiliation, but as a reminder, because authority wasn't proven by shouting or by breaking people. It was proven by standing in the same storm as everyone else and never bending. And long after the rain had washed the yard clean, the image that remained in every recruit's mind was the same: a woman standing alone in the center of the storm, silent, unbroken,